Hello, I'm Robert Ewell, and today I'm continuing my series on being a good steward of God's kingdom based on Genesis 1:26. So what is the cleanest energy? Well, before we take a look at that, I'd like to review a little bit of what we covered in the previous week. We looked at the book of Job and the many unanswered questions in there that God asked Job, many which pertain to being good stewards of this world. How does the water cycle work? How are we supposed to treat the ecosystems? So I'm going to pick one of the commands of God regarding taking care of the ecosystem and review a story in history of what happened when God's guidelines were not followed. So kind of an unusual story to be sharing, but hopefully you'll enjoy it. In 1821, the Greek people rose up and revolted against their Turkish overlords trying to become a free nation. Um, let's just say that they were not well matched. A bunch of, at best, brigand type fighters, a village type based economy. Their navy was basically more akin to being pirates against one of the major powers of Europe. Maybe not in the best state, but the Turks, they had a competent navy, and they even had a pretty competent army trained by the French after the Napoleonic era. It didn't go well for them, and the Turks were slowly crushing the Greek rebellion, village by village, town by town. However, there was a rule of war that was based on Deuteronomy 2019, which says you can't cut down the fruit trees. It's right there in Deuteronomy. When you're fighting a war, you can burn the crops, but do not chop down the trees, the fruit trees. Well, the Turks were doing that. And the great powers of Europe, who really didn't want to have Greece become an independent nation, it was upsetting the balance of powers they had. These great powers were Russia, Austria, and England. They were not very happy about this, and the French saw an opportunity to get back into power, and so they negotiated a treaty with the English and the Russians to try and split the three-party agreement, and they were successful. And those three countries sent a naval force to Greece to get the Turks to stop chopping the trees down. Well, they showed up. The British admiral was senior, so he was placed in charge. He negotiated with the Egyptian army commander of the Turkish army, who agreed, yeah, no more, we won't chop any more trees down. And so the British were the masters of trust but verify. And so he sent his small ships out and they checked on them, and no, they were still chopping trees down and burning them. And so he sails up to where the Turkish Navy was located. It was called the Bay of Navarino, and confirmed, yeah, they're still doing it. So when the wind was favorable, he sailed his combined fleet of Russian, French, and English ships into the Bay of Navarino against the Turkish fleet to tell them to stop. He had very strict guidelines in terms of what they could do. They weren't allowed to shoot at the Turks. They were just there to try and persuade them to stop burning and cutting down trees. So when they entered into the bay, the Turks opened fire on them. Well, that's something they could respond to. And so he hoisted return fire, and a naval battle, the last major naval battle of wooden ships, broke out. There were 65 Turkish ships in their navy. There was only 27 between the three combined fleets. This was the Battle of Navarino. And so in 1827, that combined Allied fleet sank or destroyed or grounded the entire Turkish fleet of 65 ships. And that was the day the Greek Revolution ended, and the Greeks had won because the Turks were not following God's rules on how to take care of the planet. Little interesting piece of history. So, what is the cleanest energy? Well, we'll just kind of pop through the list here. Coal Coal actually is fairly small environmental footprint compared to other energy sources to get access to it, get it out of the ground. And people have gotten pretty good about putting the ground back together when they're done, especially open pit mining. It can be burned cleanly or not. Many countries, as I mentioned, China does not burn their coal cleanly, which is why this is a picture in the background of what Beijing looks like on a clear day. That's primarily due to burning coal. So probably not coal. After that, burning petroleum, we do that in automobiles as a major source. It's the convenience of it's a high energy density fuel. And so the cars are inexpensive. Oh, remember that metric. If the vehicle is less expensive, that means I used fewer resources to make that car. And that is a smaller environmental footprint. So that's a positive for a gasoline powered vehicle against maybe an electric one, which is much more expensive. Hybrid, kind of in between. How about natural gas? That's a very clean fuel for the fossil fuels. It is the cleanest. It's not hard to extract it. Normally, a waste product today of being producing petroleum, we get the natural gas essentially as a freebie. And it is actually the safest fuel to put into a vehicle. Batteries do not do well in collisions. Gasoline does not do well in collisions. It is really hard to get natural gas to explode. People pretend that it does, but it actually doesn't. If you don't believe me, there is a Mythbuster show where they try and blow a building up with natural gas. It is not easy to do. It has to be perfect conditions to get that to happen. Well, other than that, what else can we do? Nuclear? Well, there's two problems. Nuclear. What do you do with the nuclear waste? We are not good at managing that. That's been a failure on our part. And the other problem is that when a nuclear reactor shuts down, it continues to make 7% of its output power. That's called decay heat. The atom is split, but the subpieces keep decaying as well, and they release heat when they do that, and that goes on for days. And so, for example, when Japan's reactor shut down due to a tidal wave, they, for aesthetic reasons, did not follow the manufacturer's guidelines and put their generators on the roof of the building. They put them in the basement, and the tidal wave went right over their seawall and flooded the basement. The reactor shut down. They had no electricity to keep the cooling pumps running, and they melted their reactor down. And so that's the other problem, the nuclear meltdown on nuclear reactors. Geothermal is up and coming. That's exciting. That's just hot rock. There's a lot of hot rock in the world. Think Pacific Ocean and the Ring of Fire all around it. And the new technology is now coming out. We don't have to have the rock hot enough to make steam, just make hot water. And so there's a lot of interest in geothermal. We have solar. I've talked a little bit about in the past. The problem with solar is that it takes a lot of resources to make a solar panel. And so while those costs are coming down or getting more efficient, it still has a pretty big environmental footprint. And of course, you other environmental footprint associated with solar is it takes a lot of real estate. And that has environmental impact as well. And so it's not the perfect solution that people would hope. And of course, then you have to deal with the fact is it doesn't make any electricity when there's no sunlight. And so you have a lot of other expensive things you have to do, like batteries or other types of standby generation to cover for that gap in solar. The new one on the list is fusion. We now have had sustained fusion in the lab. That's amazing, producing a great amount of energy. I think they're over 20 seconds now for how long they've been able to keep the reaction going. And maybe within my lifetime, I hope I live that long to see the first commercial fusion plant. That would be very clean energy. It takes hydrogen and combines it and makes helium. And you don't get the radioactive debris. You don't get a greenhouse gas. And hydrogen is pretty much the most common infinite supply molecule you could think of. So it's the power of the sun. There's two other phrases on here, though. The cleanest energy is the energy you don't use. And so as a sustainability manager, I focused on energy saving projects. And we could save about, on average, about 40% of the energy consumption. I can go in and save that pretty much anywhere I've been. And that's clean. That's the cleanest energy. And there's one more on there. I'll leave that one for you to think about. It's the energy others don't use. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this talk. I'll provide more details on some of these types of energy in future sessions. Look forward to seeing you next week. Bye.